The kettle sat on the highest shelf in the kitchen, just beyond easy reach, and when Faron Whitley raised his hand toward it, the orc woman standing beside him jerked backward so violently that she knocked over the wooden stool behind her. The clatter rang through the morning quiet like a bell struck in fear, and for a heartbeat neither of them moved. He froze with his arm still lifted, fingers outstretched toward the copper vessel that had been his mother's, and she stood pressed against the far wall with her green hands covering her mouth, and her amber eyes gone wide and wet. Then the tears came, silent and terrible, tracking down her cheeks as she stared at him with something worse than fear, something that looked like shame so deep it had hollowed her out from the inside. Faron lowered his arm slowly, the kettle forgotten, and turned to face her fully. He was a tall man, lean and weathered from years working the frontier land alone, his dark hair threaded with early silver though he had not yet seen 40 winters. His face had been called hard by those who knew him in the nearby settlement of Crestfall, all sharp planes and a mouth that rarely curved into anything resembling a smile. But his eyes, pale gray like morning mist, held something gentler than his exterior promised, a steadiness that had drawn wounded creatures to his doorstep more than once. The orc woman was simply the first of her kind. Her name was Elara, and she had arrived 3 weeks earlier in the snow-melt rains of early spring, thin as a willow branch, and shaking so hard her tusks had chattered. She had collapsed in his barn, and he had found her there among the hay bales when he went to tend his horses at dawn. For 2 days she had burned with fever, and he had tended her with the same quiet patience he gave to everything, bringing cool water and thin broth, never speaking unless necessary. When the fever broke, she had tried to leave, but he had seen the way she moved, favoring her left side where bruises bloomed like poisonous flowers beneath her green skin, and he had simply told her the door was there if she chose it. But so was a bed in the small room off the kitchen, if she needed time to heal. She had stayed, and in the weeks that followed she had made herself small and useful, mending his clothes with neat stitches, tending the kitchen garden that had gone to weeds after his mother passed, moving through his home like a ghost who feared becoming solid enough to be noticed. She spoke rarely, and when she did her voice was so soft he sometimes had to lean closer to hear her. She never met his eyes for longer than a moment. She startled at sudden sounds, at the crack of the firewood settling, at the horses whinnying in the paddock. But nothing had prepared him for the violence of her reaction, to his simple reach for a kettle. Now she stood against the wall weeping, and Faron felt something crack open in his chest, some place he had kept sealed and frozen since the war that had taken his youth and left him wanting only silence and distance from the world. He did not know what to do with tears. He did not know what to do with this kind of fear that went bone deep. So he did what he always did when confronted with things beyond his understanding. He waited, still and quiet as stone, until she could find her way back to herself. It took longer than he expected. The tears kept coming, and with them small sounds of distress that she tried to muffle behind her hands. Her shoulders shook. Her pointed ears lay flat against her dark hair. Finally, when the worst of it had passed, she lowered her hands and looked at him with eyes red and swollen. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry. You were only reaching for the kettle. I know you were only reaching for the kettle. I am sorry." Faron shook his head once, a small movement. "No need." "There is every need," Elara said, and her voice broke on the last word. "You have given me shelter and safety, and I repay you with this foolishness. With this broken thing I have become, I should leave. I should have left before I brought this shame into your home." "You will not leave," Faron said, and his voice was flat and certain. "Not until you are ready." Not until you choose to for your own reasons, not because you think I want you gone. She stared at him and fresh tears spilled over. Why? The question was barely audible. Why do you let me stay? I am nothing to you. An orc who appeared in your barn, a creature most humans would have driven off or worse. Why show me this kindness? Faron was quiet for a long moment, considering his words the way he always did, measuring them like grain. Because you needed it, he said finally. Because turning away someone who needs help has never sat right with me. Because my mother raised me to believe that kindness costs nothing and means everything. He paused, then added more quietly, because I know what it looks like when someone has been broken by cruelty, and I will not add to that weight. Elara drew in a shaking breath and wrapped her arms around herself. She was small for an orc, barely reaching his shoulder, with a slender build that seemed too fragile for the tusks that curved gently from her lower jaw. Her skin was the deep green of summer leaves, and her hair fell in a thick braid down her back, black as crow feathers. She wore one of his mother's old dresses, simple gray wool that hung loose on her thin frame. Everything about her spoke of someone who had learned to make herself smaller, quieter, less visible. I was married, she said suddenly, the words tumbling out as though she had been holding them back for too long. To an orc man from my clan, Druk Hessek. He was respected among our people, a strong warrior, a good hunter. Everyone said I was fortunate to be chosen by him. And for a while I believed them. I believed I was fortunate. Faron said nothing, but he moved slowly to the table and pulled out a chair, sitting down so that he was lower than her, less imposing. After a moment, Elara came forward and sank into the chair across from him, her hands twisting together in her lap. He was not kind, she continued, her voice steady now but distant, as though she were telling a story about someone else. At first it was only words. I was too slow, too clumsy, too stupid to do things properly. Then it was, more, a push. A slap, always where it would not show or where it could be explained away. I walked into a door. I fell down the stairs. I am so careless, you understand, so foolish. Her fingers tightened until the knuckles paled. I learned to watch his hands, to watch his face, to know the signs of when his anger was rising, to be very still and very quiet and hope he would not notice me. But sometimes he noticed anyway. Sometimes it did not matter how careful I was. Faron felt the ice in his chest crack further, and beneath it, something hot and terrible stirred. He knew men like the one she described. He had served alongside some of them during the war, had seen the way they treated those weaker than themselves, had despised them with a depth of feeling he usually reserved for nothing and no one. But he kept his face still and his voice level when he spoke. How did you get away? He went on a hunting trip with other men from our clan, Elara said. 3 weeks, perhaps a month, tracking elk through the northern territories. I knew it was my only chance. I took nothing but the clothes I wore and what food I could carry, and I ran. I ran for days until my feet bled, and when I could not run anymore, I walked. I did not know where I was going. I only knew I could not go back. She looked up at him then, and her eyes held a desperate need for him to understand. In our clan, a marriage is not easily broken. A wife belongs to her husband. If he comes for me, if he demands I return, many would say he has that right, that I am his property and he is simply reclaiming what is his. He has no rights here, Faron said, and his voice was granite. This is not your clan. This is the frontier territory, and we have laws, different laws. But orc traditions mean nothing if they contradict human law and human land, Faron interrupted. If he comes, we will deal with it, legally, properly. You are not property. You are a person, and no one has the right to harm you or force you anywhere you do not wish to go. Elara stared at him for a long moment, and then her face crumpled and she began to cry again. But this time there was something different in the tears, something that might have been relief or hope or simply exhaustion. Faron waited, patient as always, until she had cried herself out. Then he stood and retrieved the kettle himself, filling it from the water barrel and hanging it over the fire to heat. "We will have tea," he said. "And then you will eat something, and then we will go about the day as we always do." She nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve, and he pretended not to notice the way her hands still trembled. The days that followed settled into their familiar rhythm, but something had shifted between them. Some wall had been breached by her confession and his steady response to it. Elara still startled sometimes, still moved with the careful quiet of prey that knows predators hunt by sound, but gradually she began to speak more, to offer small observations about the garden or the weather or the chickens that scratched in the yard. Faron, who had grown accustomed to silence in the years since his mother's passing, found himself listening for her voice, missing it when she was quiet for too long. He learned that she had a gift for growing things, that under her care the garden flourished with vegetables and herbs that would keep them well fed through the coming seasons. He learned that she hummed while she worked, tuneless little melodies that seemed to come from someplace beyond thought. He learned that she loved the horses, spending long hours in the barn brushing their coats and talking to them in her own language, the guttural orcish that sounded harsh to human ears but held its own rough music. She learned that he was a man of few words but great steadiness, that his silence was not coldness but simply his nature. She learned that he rose before dawn every morning and worked until dusk, tending the fields and the animals with a tireless dedication that spoke of someone who found purpose in labor. She learned that he had fought in the border wars 15 years ago, that he had seen things that left shadows in his eyes, and that he had come home to this remote homestead seeking peace and finding only loneliness until she arrived. Spring deepened into early summer, and the land around the homestead came alive with green and gold. Elara grew stronger, her body filling out with regular meals and safety, the bruises fading to memory. She laughed for the first time one morning when one of the hens stole a crust of bread right from Faron's hand, and the sound was so unexpected and bright that he stopped mid-stride and stared at her. She had flushed then, embarrassed by her own levity, but he had smiled, a small, careful curve of his mouth that transformed his stern face into something almost handsome. "You should do that more often," he said. "Laugh." "Yes." "Perhaps I will," she replied, "if you keep giving the chickens your breakfast." It was a small moment, a nothing moment, but it felt like a turning point nonetheless. But peace on the frontier was always borrowed time, always conditional on the goodwill of distance and chance. On a hot afternoon in midsummer, when the sun beat down on the golden fields and the air shimmered with heat, a figure appeared on the road that led to the homestead. Elara saw him first, and Faron heard her sharp intake of breath from where he stood in the barn doorway. He turned and followed her gaze, and his jaw tightened. The figure was an orc male, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the confident stride of someone who had never known defeat. Even from a distance, Faron could see the way Elara had gone rigid, the way all the color had drained from her green skin, leaving her pale as winter grass. "That is him," she whispered. "That is Druk." Faron nodded once, his mind already working through possibilities. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Stay there, I will handle this." "He will not listen to you," Elara said, and there was panic rising in her voice. "He will say I am his wife, that I belong with him. He will say you have no right to keep me here." "I am not keeping you anywhere," Faron said, his voice steady as bedrock. "You are here by your own choice. That is what I will tell him." Now go inside and lock the door. Do not come out unless I call for you." She hesitated, torn between obedience and the fear that he would be hurt because of her, but finally she turned and ran for the house. Faron watched until he heard the door close and the bolt slide home, and then he walked out to meet the approaching orc. Druk Hessek was everything Faron had imagined and worse. He stood perhaps 6.5 feet tall, his body layered with muscle that spoke of a lifetime of physical dominance. His skin was a darker green than Elara's, almost forest dark, and his tusks were thick and prominent, filed to points that suggested they had been used as weapons. He wore leather and furs despite the summer heat, and a long knife hung at his belt. His eyes were small and black and flat, devoid of warmth or empathy. When he reached the yard in front of the homestead, he stopped and looked Faron up and down with obvious contempt. "You are the human who harbors my wife," Druk said. His voice was deep and rough, his human speech accented but clear. "I am here to take her home." "She is not your wife any longer," Faron replied, his voice level. "She left you. She chooses to be here." Druk's lip curled into something that might have been a smile but looked more like a snarl. "She does not get to choose. Among my people, a wife is bound to her husband until death. Her wishes are irrelevant. She is mine, and I will have her back." "Your people's customs do not hold authority here," Faron said. "This is human territory under the jurisdiction of the frontier magistrate. If Elara wishes to end the marriage, there are legal means to do so." "Legal means," Druk repeated, his voice dripping with scorn. "You think your human laws mean anything to me? You think I will leave without her because some magistrate you have never even met says I should?" He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. "Give her to me now, or I will take her by force." Faron did not move, did not reach for the axe that leaned against the barn wall within easy reach. He simply stood, arms loose at his sides, his gray eyes cold and assessing. "If you draw that knife, I will defend what is mine," Faron said quietly. "This land, this home, and those who shelter under my roof. You will not take her, not today, not ever." Druk stared at him, and for a moment Faron thought the orc would attack, consequences be damned. But something in Faron's stillness, in the absolute certainty in his voice, gave Druk pause. He was a bully and a brute, but he was not stupid. He could see that Faron was not afraid, and that meant Faron was either very foolish or very dangerous. Druk had not survived this long by ignoring such signs. "She is marked," Druk said instead, changing tactics. "Marked as mine. Our marriage was witnessed by the clan elders, blessed by the shamans. You cannot simply undo such bindings with your human bureaucracy." "We can try," Faron said. "And we will. There is a magistrate in Crestfall, 2 days' ride from here. We will go to him, present the case, and let him decide according to the law of this territory. If you truly believe you have a claim, present your evidence before him, but you will not take Elara by force from this land." Druk's eyes narrowed. "And if I refuse, if I simply take her now, then you will be breaking the law and I will report you to the territorial militia," Faron replied. "They take a dim view of abduction on the frontier. You might escape today, but they will hunt you. And you will have marked yourself as an outlaw in human lands, unable to trade, unable to travel freely. Is one woman worth that?" It was a calculated risk, appealing to Druk's self-interest rather than his better nature, which Faron suspected did not exist. But it worked. Druk's hand moved away from his knife, though his expression remained murderous. "Fine," he spat. "We will go to your magistrate. We will see what he says about a wife who abandons her husband, who breaks sacred oaths. But I warn you, human, if this magistrate rules in my favor, I will take her and you will not stand in my way. And if he does not, I will find other means. She is mine. That will not change. Then we will go tomorrow, Faron said. You can make camp here tonight in the far field beyond the barn. You will not approach the house. You will not speak to Elara. In the morning we will all travel to Crestfall together. Drook laughed, a harsh and ugly sound. You think I need your permission to camp on your land? No, Faron said. I think you need my cooperation if you want this matter resolved legally. If you would rather do it another way, you are welcome to try. They stared at each other, wills locked, and finally Drook turned and stalked toward the far field, muttering something in Orcish that Faron did not understand but could easily interpret. When he was gone, Faron remained standing in the yard for several minutes, ensuring Drook was truly leaving before he walked back to the house and knocked gently on the door. Elara. It is safe. Let me in. The bolt slid back and the door opened a crack, and Elara's face appeared, pale and frightened. What did he say? He claims you as his wife under Orc custom, Faron said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. I told him that means nothing here, that we would take the matter to the magistrate in Crestfall and have it resolved properly. He agreed, though not happily. He will never let me go, Elara whispered. Even if the magistrate rules against him, he will not accept it. He will find a way to take me back or to punish me for leaving. That is who he is. Faron looked at her, at the fear written in every line of her body, and felt that hot, terrible thing in his chest burn brighter. Then we will cross that bridge when we come to it, he said. For now, we prepare for the journey. Pack what you need for several days. We leave at first light. That night, Elara did not sleep. Faron heard her moving about in the small room off the kitchen, heard the creak of the bed frame as she sat and rose. He lay awake in his own room, staring at the ceiling and thinking through every possible outcome of the coming days. He had told Elara they would resolve this legally, and he meant it. He was not a violent man by choice, though he had been a soldier once and knew his way around weapons. But violence solved nothing in the long term, only created new cycles of vengeance and bloodshed. The law might be slow and imperfect, but it was better than the alternative. Still, he made sure his knife was sharp and his rifle was loaded before he finally drifted into uneasy sleep. They set out at dawn, a strange procession. Faron on his gray gelding, Elara on the chestnut mare that had been his mother's favorite, and Drook on foot, keeping pace with an ease that spoke of his physical power. They did not speak to each other during the journey. Faron kept himself between Elara and Drook at all times, a silent barrier, and Drook seemed content to glower and brood, his presence a constant threat even in silence. The road to Crestfall wound through rolling farmland and patches of dense forest, past other homesteads where families worked their fields and children played in the yards. Faron saw the way people stared at them, at the orc woman and the orc man and the human leading them both. He saw the fear and the curiosity and the judgment in their faces, and he ignored it all, keeping his eyes forward and his thoughts on the task ahead. They reached Crestfall late on the second day, as the sun was sinking toward the western hills and painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The settlement was small but prosperous, a collection of sturdy wooden buildings arranged around a central square where a market was held twice a week. There was an inn, a blacksmith, a general store, and a modest building that served as both courthouse and magistrate's office. Faron led them directly to the latter, dismounting and tying the horses before turning to Elara. "Come," he said. "We will speak to Magistrate Terrell now if he is available." Elara climbed down from her horse, her legs shaking after 2 days of riding, and Faron steadied her with a hand on her elbow. Drook watched this small gesture with narrowed eyes but said nothing. Together they entered the building. Magistrate Gareth Terrell was a man in his 60s, lean and silver-haired, with the shrewd eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime weighing evidence and rendering judgment. He looked up from the papers on his desk as they entered, and his eyebrows rose at the sight of two orcs and a human filing into his office. "Faron Whitley," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "I have not seen you in Crestfall in months. What brings you here and with such unusual company?" "A legal matter, Magistrate," Faron said. "One that requires your attention and your expertise." Terrell leaned back in his chair and gestured to the seats in front of his desk. "Then sit and tell me everything." It took the better part of an hour to lay out the full story. Elara spoke haltingly at first, her voice barely above a whisper, but with Faron's quiet encouragement she found her strength and recounted her marriage, the abuse she had endured, and her flight to freedom. Druk interrupted several times, claiming she was exaggerating, that she was weak and overly sensitive, that a firm hand was necessary to manage a wife properly. Each time, Magistrate Terrell silenced him with a raised hand and a sharp look. When Elara had finished, Terrell turned to Druk. "And you claim her as your wife under Orcish tradition, demanding her return?" "I do," Druk said. "She is mine. That is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether your human laws have any bearing on a marriage conducted among orcs, according to our customs." Terrell steepled his fingers and regarded them both thoughtfully. "An interesting question," he said, "but not without precedent. This territory, and indeed all lands under the governance of the Crown, operate under a unified legal system. While we respect the traditions and customs of all peoples who live within our borders, those customs cannot supersede our laws when they come into conflict. And our laws are quite clear on the matter of marriage and personal autonomy." He pulled a thick volume from the shelf behind his desk and paged through it until he found what he was looking for. "Here," he said, pointing to a passage. "The Frontier Territory Statutes, Section 12, Paragraph 7. Any individual, regardless of race or origin, who resides within the territorial boundaries has the right to petition for dissolution of a marriage bond on grounds of cruelty, abandonment, or irreconcilable differences. Such petition shall be heard and judged according to the laws of the territory, and cultural customs of origin shall be considered but shall not supersede the rights of the petitioner." He looked up at Elara. "Miss Hessick, do you wish to petition for dissolution of your marriage on grounds of cruelty?" Elara's voice was stronger now, steadier. "I do. And do you have evidence of this cruelty?" She hesitated, then slowly pushed up the sleeve of her dress, revealing old scars on her forearm, pale lines against her green skin. "I have these," she said quietly, "and many more besides, and I have my word if that counts for anything." "It counts for a great deal," Terrell said gently. "Druk Hessick, do you deny inflicting these injuries?" Druk's face darkened. "She is clumsy. She injures herself. I cannot be held responsible for her own foolishness." "That is not an answer to my question," Terrell said, his voice hardening. "Did you or did you not strike your wife, causing injury?" The silence stretched long, and finally Druk looked away. "Sometimes discipline is necessary. She would not learn otherwise. Then you admit to physical violence against her." "I admit to managing my household as I see fit," Druk snarled, "as is my right." "Not in this territory, it is not," Terrell said flatly. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, his pen scratching across the page with firm, decisive strokes. "I am granting Miss Hessick's petition for dissolution of marriage. The union between Elara Hessick and Druk Hessick is hereby declared null and void under the laws of this territory. Furthermore, Druk Hessick, You are hereby ordered to maintain a distance of no less than 500 yards from Elara at all times. You are forbidden from contacting her, approaching her, or in any way attempting to communicate with her. Violation of this order will result in your arrest and imprisonment. Druk shot to his feet, his face twisted with rage. You cannot do this. She is mine. Our marriage is sacred, blessed by the shamans. I can and I have, Terrell said calmly. And if you do not leave this office immediately, I will have you arrested for disturbing the peace. Am I understood? For a moment Faron thought Druk would attack, would overturn the desk and go for the magistrate's throat. But 2 militia guards had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices, and their presence was enough to check Druk's fury. With a final, venomous look at Elara, Druk turned and stormed out of the office, shoving past the guards with enough force to send one stumbling. When he was gone, the tension in the room eased slightly. Terrell set down his pen and looked at Elara with kind eyes. You are free now, Miss Hessek, legally and officially free. I will file this dissolution with the territorial records, and you will receive a copy for your own keeping. If he troubles you again, report it to the militia immediately. Do you understand? Elara nodded, tears streaming down her face, but these were different tears than the ones she had shed in Faron's kitchen. These were tears of relief, of a burden lifted, of a door closed and another opened. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. They stayed the night in Crestfall, taking rooms at the inn, and in the morning they began the journey back to the homestead. Druk was nowhere to be seen, and Faron hoped he had taken the magistrate's warning seriously and left the territory entirely. But he knew better than to trust in hope alone. Men like Druk did not accept defeat gracefully. They would have to remain vigilant. The ride home was quieter than the ride out, but it was a different kind of quiet, peaceful rather than tense. Elara sat straighter in her saddle, her shoulders no longer hunched in on themselves, and when Faron glanced back at her, he saw something in her face that he had not seen before, the beginning of true calm. When they reached the homestead 3 days later, the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold, and the familiar sight of the barn and the house and the fields spreading out in all directions filled Faron with a sense of rightness he had not known he was missing. This was home, and Elara was here, and she was safe. For now, that was enough. But that night, as he lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the house settling, he found himself thinking about the magistrate's words, about the dissolution being complete and official. He found himself thinking about what came next, about whether Elara would stay or whether she would feel the need to move on, to find her own place in the world now that she was free to do so. The thought of her leaving left a hollow ache in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. He had grown accustomed to her presence, he realized. More than accustomed. He looked forward to seeing her at the breakfast table each morning, to hearing her hum as she worked in the garden, to the quiet conversations they shared in the evenings as the light faded and the day's work was done. She had brought life back into this house, warmth and light and something he could only call joy. And he did not want to lose that, did not want to lose her. But he was not a man who spoke easily of such things, who knew how to voice feelings that had been locked away for so long he had forgotten they existed. So he said nothing, and the days moved forward, summer ripening into its full heat, the fields turning gold with wheat and barley. Elara stayed, and if she thought about leaving she gave no sign of it. She worked beside Faron in the fields, helping with the harvest, her strength surprising him with its quiet endurance. She tended the animals and the garden and the house, and gradually the haunted look faded from her eyes, replaced by something calmer, something that might almost be called happiness. The flinching stopped, or mostly stopped. There were still moments when a sudden movement would make her tense, when shadows crossed her face and her breath would quicken. But they grew fewer and farther between, and Faron learned to move slowly around her, to give warning before he reached for things, to respect the space she needed as she healed. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one in the deepening blue of the sky, Elara spoke into the comfortable silence between them. "Why have you never married?" she asked. Faron was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "I suppose I never found the right person," he said finally. "Or perhaps I was not looking. After the war, I came home wanting only peace and quiet. The idea of bringing someone into my life, of sharing this space with another person, felt like too much. I was content to be alone. And now?" Elara asked softly. He turned to look at her, at the way the starlight caught in her dark hair and made her amber eyes glow. "Now I find I am not so content with solitude as I once was." She smiled, a small and careful thing, and looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "I am glad I came here," she said. "Glad I found your barn that night. Glad you did not turn me away." "I am glad too," Faron said, and the words felt inadequate for the depth of what he was feeling, but they were all he had. They sat together in the quiet, and Faron thought about reaching for her hand, about closing the small distance between them on the porch bench. But he held back, uncertain, afraid of moving too quickly, of frightening her with the intensity of his own growing feelings. So he simply sat beside her, and that was enough for now. Autumn came, painting the world in shades of rust and amber and gold. They worked together to bring in the last of the harvest, to prepare the fields for winter, to stock the cellar with preserved vegetables and smoked meat. Faron taught Elara how to split wood properly, how to stack it so it would dry and burn well through the cold months ahead. She taught him recipes her mother had taught her, hearty stews and flatbreads that filled the house with warm, savory smells. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the space between them closed. A hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair. Her fingers brushing his as she handed him a cup of tea. Small touches, careful and tentative, testing the boundaries of what was allowed, what was wanted. One cold morning in early winter, when frost coated the windows and their breath misted in the air inside the house, Elara woke early and came into the kitchen to find Faron already there, building up the fire in the hearth. She moved to the shelf where the kettle lived, the high shelf that had once been the site of her shame and her breaking. She reached up without hesitation, her fingers closing around the copper handle, and lifted it down easily. Faron turned from the fire and watched her fill the kettle from the water barrel, watched her hang it over the flames to heat. When she turned back to him, their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding that required no words. "I am not afraid anymore," Elara said quietly. "Not of you, not of raised hands reaching for innocent things. You have given me that gift, whether you realize it or not, safety, trust, the knowledge that not all touch comes with violence attached." Faron crossed the space between them in 3 strides and took her hand in his calloused fingers gentle around her slender ones. "Elara," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer, like something sacred. "I am not a man of pretty words or grand gestures. I do not know how to speak the things I feel, and I do not know if I am worthy of what I am about to ask. But I need you to know that you have become essential to me, that this house is only a home because you are in it, that I do not want to imagine my days without you in them." Her breath caught, and fresh tears gathered in her eyes, but they were good tears, bright and clean. "What are you asking me, Faron?" He took a breath, steadying himself, and met her gaze directly. "I am asking if you would consider staying. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through until something better comes along, but as my partner, My wife, if you would have me, though I know you have reason to fear that word and all it entails. You are nothing like him, Elara said fiercely. Nothing. You are kind and patient and good, and you have never once made me feel small or afraid or worthless. You have given me back myself, piece by piece, and I. She faltered, then continued more quietly. I love you, Faron Whitley. I think I have loved you since the day you simply let me be broken in your kitchen and did not demand I fix myself faster or better. Since the day you stood between me and the man who hurt me and did not flinch. Then, is that a yes? He asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in his voice, something that suggested he had expected rejection despite his brave words. Yes, Elara said, and she smiled, wide and genuine, her tusks flashing white in the firelight. Yes, I will stay. Yes, I will marry you if you are certain this is what you want. I have never been more certain of anything, Faron said, and then, carefully, telegraphing his movements so she could see them coming and had every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, chaste and brief, but it held within it all the promise of the future they would build together, all the warmth and trust and careful love that had grown between them in the months since she had stumbled into his barn more dead than alive. When he pulled back, they were both smiling, and outside the window the sun was rising over the snow-covered fields, painting everything in shades of pink and gold. They were married 3 weeks later in Crestfall, with Magistrate Terrell officiating and a handful of townspeople serving as witnesses. Elara wore a dress Faron had commissioned from the seamstress in town, deep blue wool with silver embroidery at the collar and cuffs, and she was so beautiful it made his chest ache. He wore his best coat, the black one he had inherited from his father, and felt ridiculous and solemn and happier than he had ever thought possible. The ceremony was simple. They exchanged vows, promising to care for one another in sickness and health, in good times and bad, for all the years they were given. They exchanged rings, simple silver bands that Faron had bought from the blacksmith with money saved from the harvest. And when Terrell pronounced them married, Faron kissed his wife again, and this time it was deeper, more confident, full of the knowledge that she was his and he was hers and nothing would separate them. They held a small celebration at the inn afterward, with food and drink and music provided by a traveling musician who happened to be passing through. Elara danced with Faron, her hand in his, and if some of the townspeople looked at them askance, if some whispered about the strangeness of a human marrying an orc, neither of them cared. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. They returned to the homestead as the first snow of winter began to fall, fat flakes drifting down from a pewter sky. Faron carried Elara over the threshold, and she laughed and protested that she was perfectly capable of walking, but he ignored her and carried her all the way to the bedroom anyway, just because he could, just because she was his wife now and he wanted to hold her close. That night they made love for the first time, slow and careful and achingly tender, each of them learning the shape and feel of the other, exploring with hands and lips and whispered words. Elara wept again, but these were tears of joy, of release, of finding something she had thought lost forever. And Faron held her afterward, her head pillowed on his chest, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder, and felt a peace settle over him that he had not known since before the war. Winter passed in a blur of quiet domesticity, of mornings waking tangled together in the warmth of their bed, of days spent tending the animals and mending tools and preparing for spring. They talked for hours in the evenings, learning each other's stories, sharing memories both bitter and sweet. Faron told her about his childhood, about his mother who had been fierce and loving in equal measure, about his father who had died when Faron was young. He told her about the war, about the things he had seen and done, about the nightmares that still sometimes woke him in the dark hours before dawn. Elara told him about her own childhood in the Orc clans, about her parents who had loved her but had also believed in the old ways, in the rigid traditions that said a woman's place was beside her husband no matter what. She told him about the friends she had left behind, about the sister she missed with an ache that never fully faded. She told him about the small kindnesses she had learned to cherish, the moments of beauty she had clung to even in the darkest times. They healed together, each helping the other carry burdens too heavy to bear alone. Spring returned, and with it the work of planting and building and preparing for the growing season. Elara was stronger now, her body no longer thin and fragile, her movements confident and sure. She worked beside Faron in the fields, turning soil and planting seeds, and in the evenings she would lean against him on the porch, tired and dirty and utterly content. One morning in late spring, as the world turned green and the air filled with the songs of returning birds, Elara came to Faron as he worked in the barn and told him she was with child. He stopped mid-motion, the pitchfork frozen in his hands, and stared at her. "Truly, truly," she said, and her smile was radiant. "I suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. We are going to have a baby, Faron." He set down the pitchfork carefully and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she laughed and told him to be careful or he would crush them both. "A baby," he repeated, as though testing the word, making it real. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Elara asked, searching his face. "Happy," Faron said, "does not begin to cover what I am feeling right now." They spent the summer preparing for the new arrival, building a cradle from oak wood, sewing tiny clothes, gathering supplies. Elara bloomed with pregnancy, her face taking on a glow that Faron found mesmerizing, her body rounding gently as the baby grew. She was beautiful and fierce and so full of life that sometimes he had to stop and simply look at her, marveling that she was his, that they had built this life together. In the autumn, when the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp, their daughter was born. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Faron feared he would lose them both, but Elara was strong, stronger than he had ever imagined. And when the midwife from Crestfall finally placed the squalling infant in his arms, he felt something in him shift and settle, some final piece falling into place. The baby was perfect, a tiny miracle with green-tinged skin, and the smallest tusks barely visible in her gums, her pointed ears delicate as flower petals. She had her mother's amber eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and when she wrapped her impossibly small hand around his finger, Faron felt his heart crack open in a way he had not known was possible. "What shall we name her?" Elara asked, exhausted but smiling from the bed. Faron looked down at the baby in his arms, at the new life they had created together, and thought about all the things they had overcome to reach this moment. "Dessa," he said. "Her name is Dessa." "Dessa Whitley," Elara repeated softly. "It is perfect." The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder, of learning how to care for this tiny person who depended on them for everything. Dessa was a good baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, and she grew rapidly, her green skin darkening to match her mother's, her eyes bright and curious. Faron found himself transformed by fatherhood in ways he had not anticipated. He who had been so comfortable with silence now found himself talking constantly to his daughter, narrating his days, singing her nonsense songs as he carried her around the homestead. He who had held the world at arm's length now held this small person against his chest, and felt his defenses crumble into dust. And Elara, watching him with their daughter, fell in love with him all over again, deeper and truer than before. Time moved forward as it always does, marking them with its passage. Dessa grew from infant to toddler, taking her first steps in the kitchen where her mother had once flinched at a raised hand, speaking her first words in the garden where green things grew under her mother's care. They celebrated her first birthday with cake and songs, and her second, and her third, and each year felt like a gift they had not dared hope for. There were hard times too, as there always are. One winter, a sickness swept through Crestfall and reached even their remote homestead, and Dessa burned with fever for 3 terrifying days before it finally broke. Another year the harvest failed and they had to tighten their belts and make every scrap of food stretch. But they weathered these storms together, Faron and Elara, and they emerged stronger each time. And always, there was kindness between them. Faron never raised his hand in anger, never spoke a harsh word without immediately softening it with an apology. Elara never flinched when he reached for her, never pulled away from his touch. The fear that had once defined her became a distant memory, something she could speak of without shame, a part of her past but not her present. One evening in early summer, when Dessa was 5 years old and playing in the yard with the chickens, Elara and Faron sat together on the porch as they had done countless times before. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of lavender and rose, and the air was warm and sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. "You remember the day you reached for the kettle?" Elara asked suddenly. Faron glanced at her, surprised. They spoke of that day rarely, both understanding it as a turning point but neither wanting to dwell on the pain it represented. "I remember," he said. "I wept because I was so ashamed," Elara continued. "Ashamed that I had let him reduce me to that, to someone who could not even stand in a kitchen without fear. Ashamed that you had seen me like that, broken and pathetic." "You were never pathetic," Faron said firmly. "You were surviving. There is no shame in that." "I know that now," Elara said. "But in that moment I thought I would never be whole again. I thought that fear would define me forever." She turned to look at him, her eyes bright. "But you helped me heal. Not by pretending the wounds did not exist, not by rushing me to be better before I was ready, just by being steady. By being kind, by giving me space to become myself again in my own time." "You did the work yourself," Faron said. "I only provided the space." "We did it together," Elara corrected. "And I want you to know that I am grateful. Every single day I am grateful for you, for this life, for the family we have built. I am grateful that when I reach for the kettle now, I feel nothing but the weight of copper in my hands. No fear, no shame, just the simple act of making tea." Faron reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I am grateful too," he said, "for you, for Dessa, for the chance to build something good and true in a world that often feels too full of cruelty." They sat in silence for a while, watching their daughter chase chickens in the golden light, listening to her laughter ring out across the homestead. And Faron thought about the man he had been before Elara came into his life, lonely and closed off, content with solitude because he had never known anything better. And he thought about the man he was now, a husband and a father, someone who woke each morning with purpose and joy, someone who had learned that opening your heart to another person was the bravest and most worthwhile thing you could do. "You think we will have more children?" Elara asked, breaking into his thoughts. Faron smiled. "Would you like to?" "I think I would," Elara said. "I think Dessa would love a sibling, and I think you would be an excellent father to however many children we are blessed with." "Then we will have more," Faron said simply. "As many as come. We will fill this house with love and laughter and make it a home in truth." And so they did. 2 years later, a son was born, a boy they named Nalan, who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's fierce spirit. And 3 years after that, another son, Xavier, who was quiet and thoughtful, happiest with a book in his hands. The house that had once been so silent rang now with children's voices, with arguments and games and the constant motion of young lives being lived fully. Dessa grew into a young woman who was strong and capable, who could outwork most men twice her age and still have energy to spare. She had her mother's gift for growing things and her father's steady patience, and she was loved by everyone who knew her. Nalan was the adventurer, always climbing trees and exploring the edges of the woods, coming home dirty and scraped and grinning from ear to ear. Xavier was the scholar, teaching himself to read from the few books in the house, and always asking questions about how things worked and why. Faron and Elara watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and wonder, marveling at the people they were becoming. And through it all, through the chaos and joy and occasional heartbreak of raising a family, they remained partners, their love deepening and maturing like good wine. There were still those in Crestfall and the surrounding settlements who looked askance at their family, who muttered about the mixing of races and the impropriety of it all. But there were others too, more with each passing year, who saw only a family like any other, working hard and raising their children with love. The world was changing slowly, and Faron and Elara were part of that change, proof that different peoples could build lives together, could find common ground and create something beautiful from it. One autumn afternoon, when Dessa was 15 and the boys were 12 and 9, Magistrate Terrell came to visit. He was much older now, his hair snow-white and his movements slower, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He sat on the porch with Faron and Elara, drinking tea and watching the children play in the yard. "I wanted to see how you were doing," Terrell said. "It has been years since you came to my office, a frightened orc woman and a determined man asking for justice. I have often wondered if I made the right decision that day." "You did," Elara said firmly. "You gave me my life back. You gave us the chance to build this." She gestured to the homestead, to the children, to the life they had created. Terrell smiled. "I am glad. There have been other cases since yours, you know. Other mixed couples seeking the same protections. Other women fleeing abuse and asking for dissolution of marriages that harmed them. Your case set a precedent. It made it easier for others to find justice." "Then it was worth it," Faron said. "All of it." Terrell stayed for dinner, sharing stories and laughter with the family, and when he left at dusk, he embraced them both and told them he was proud of what they had built. "You are proof," he said, "that love is stronger than fear, that kindness is more powerful than cruelty. Do not ever forget that." After he was gone, Elara stood in the kitchen washing dishes, and Faron came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "when you could not even stand to have me in the same room without tensing?" "I remember," Elara said, leaning back against him. "But that was a lifetime ago. That was a different person." "You are still the same person," Faron said, "just healed, just whole." "We are both whole now," Elara corrected. "We healed each other." They stood together in the warm kitchen, the sounds of their children's voices drifting in from the other room, and Faron thought about the kettle on the high shelf, the one that had been the catalyst for everything that came after. He thought about the way Elara had flinched and wept, and the way she now moved through the world with confidence and grace. He thought about how far they had come, how much they had built, and he felt a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. "I love you," he said simply. "I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Elara replied, turning in his arms to face him. Thank you for reaching for that kettle all those years ago. Thank you for showing me that raised hands could mean something other than pain." They kissed, soft and sweet, and outside the window the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky, and the world turned on its axis, and in the small homestead on the frontier, a family lived and loved and thrived, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the darkest pasts could give way to bright futures, that love, given time and patience and care, could overcome anything. Years continued their steady march, and the children grew into adults with lives and dreams of their own. Sam met a young farmer from Crestfall, a kind man named Thomas who looked at her like she hung the moon, and they married in a ceremony that filled Faron and Elara's hearts to bursting. Nalan became a scout for the territorial militia, his adventurous spirit finding purpose in protecting the frontier settlements. Xavier went to the city to study, his brilliant mind earning him a place at a university, though he returned home every summer without fail. Faron's hair turned fully silver, and Elara's face gained the lines of a life well lived, but they remained as devoted to each other as they had been on their wedding day. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the fields they had worked together for decades. They still reached for each other in the night, finding comfort and warmth in familiar touches. They still talked for hours, never running out of things to say, never tiring of each other's company. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the house was still and the world seemed to hold its breath, Elara would reach for the kettle on the high shelf, and she would smile, remembering the day she had flinched and wept, remembering the long journey from fear to freedom. And Faron would watch her from the doorway, his heart full, knowing that every moment of struggle had been worth it to reach this place of peace. They had built something rare and precious, something that would last long after they were gone. They had built a family, a home, a legacy of love that would ripple outward through generations. And when people asked them the secret to their happiness, to the deep and abiding partnership that had sustained them through so many years, they would look at each other and smile, and Faron would say simply, kindness, patience, and the willingness to reach for each other even when it is hard. And Elara would add, and the courage to trust that not all raised hands mean harm, that sometimes someone is just reaching for the kettle. In the end, their story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though it had begun with both. It was a story of small moments, of daily choices to be gentle with each other, of the slow and steady work of building a life together. It was a story of healing and hope, of second chances and new beginnings. It was a story of love in its truest, most enduring form. And it was a story that, once begun, continued to unfold in beautiful and unexpected ways, year after year, season after season, a testament to the power of one person's kindness to change another's life completely. The orc girl who had flinched at her raised hand became the orc woman who reached without fear, who loved without reservation, who built a home where warmth and safety were as reliable as the sunrise. And the man who had reached only for a kettle gave her something far more valuable, a life where she never had to be afraid again, where every gesture held only kindness, where love was measured not in grand declarations, but in the simple, steady presence of someone who chose her every single day, for all the days they were given. On a spring morning many years after that first flinch, when both Faron and Elara were well into their later years, they stood together in the kitchen of the homestead that had been their haven and their joy. The kettle hung in its usual place on the high shelf, polished copper gleaming in the morning light. Elara reached for it without thought, her movements easy and sure, and filled it with fresh water from the barrel. As she hung it over the fire, Faron came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the flames lick at the copper bottom, waiting for the water to boil. "Do you know," Elara said softly, "that there are still mornings when I wake up and cannot quite believe this is my life, that I am here with you in this place of peace and plenty, that I am loved and safe and whole." Faron squeezed her hand gently. "I know the feeling. There are days when I look at you and our children and the life we have built, and I am overwhelmed by how fortunate I am, how fortunate we are. We made this fortune ourselves," Elara said. "With hard work and patience and love, we took broken pieces and made something beautiful." "That we did," Faron agreed. The kettle began to sing, its whistle rising soft and then louder, filling the kitchen with sound. Elara lifted it from the fire and poured boiling water into 2 cups, adding herbs from the garden for tea. She handed 1 cup to Faron, their fingers brushing in the familiar exchange, and they moved together to the table, sitting in the chairs they had occupied for decades. Through the window they could see the fields stretching away toward the horizon, green with new growth, full of promise. They could see the barn where it all began, where a frightened orc woman had once sought shelter and found instead a home. They could see the garden bursting with life, the chickens scratching in the yard, the whole beautiful ordinary world they had tended together for so long. "I am grateful," Elara said, breaking the companionable silence, "for all of it, for every moment, even the hard ones, because they brought us here, to this." "As am I," Faron said. "I cannot imagine my life without you in it. I do not want to." They drank their tea slowly, savoring the warmth and the flavor and the simple pleasure of sitting together in the morning light. And when the cups were empty, Elara reached across the table and took both of Faron's hands in hers. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for being the kind of man who reaches for kettles instead of raising hands in anger. For being the kind of man who saw a broken orc woman in his barn and chose kindness. For being the kind of man who kept choosing kindness every single day until I could stand whole again." Faron's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for trusting me enough to stay, for giving me the honor of being your husband, your partner, the father of your children, for teaching me that the heart is not a finite thing, that it can always grow larger, always hold more love." They sat together, hands clasped, 2 people who had found each other in the darkness and built a life together in the light. Outside, the world turned and the seasons changed and time moved ever forward. But in the warm kitchen of the homestead, in the quiet moment between 2 people who loved each other with everything they had, time seemed to pause, to hold its breath, to acknowledge something sacred. The orc girl who had once flinched and wept had become a woman of strength and grace, a wife and mother, a gardener and homemaker, a person who knew her own worth and stood tall in it. The man who had reached for a kettle had become a husband and father, a protector and provider, a person who proved every day that true strength lay not in the ability to dominate but in the choice to be gentle. Together, they had written a story that would be remembered long after they were gone, a story whispered around fires and shared in quiet moments, a story that gave hope to those who needed it most. The story of the orc girl who flinched when he raised his hand, only to discover he was reaching for the kettle, and who wept not just from fear, but from the overwhelming recognition that she had finally found someone who would never give her reason to flinch again. And that story, simple as it was, changed the world in small but significant ways, one person at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one choice to be gentle instead of harsh, to offer safety instead of fear, to reach for each other instead of pulling away. In the end, that was all any story could hope to do, To show that love was possible, that healing was possible, that people could change and grow and become better versions of themselves. That broken things could be mended, that wounds could heal, that even in the darkest moments, when fear seemed insurmountable and hope felt like a foolish dream, there was always the possibility of finding someone who would stand beside you and help you carry your burdens until they felt lighter, until you could carry them yourself, until one day you woke up and realized you were no longer carrying them at all. Faron and Elara Whitley lived to see their grandchildren grow, to hold great-grandchildren in their arms, to watch their family tree spread wide and strong across the frontier. They lived to see the world change around them, to see orcs and humans working together more and more, to see the prejudices that had once seemed insurmountable begin to crumble. They lived long lives, full lives, happy lives, and when they finally passed, within days of each other as longtime couples sometimes do, they left behind a legacy of love and kindness that their descendants carried forward into the future. The homestead remained in the family, passed down through generations, and the story of how it all began was told and retold, gaining embellishments and poetry but never losing its essential truth. That on a spring morning long ago, an orc woman flinched when a man raised his hand, and he was only reaching for the kettle, and she wept. And from that moment of fear and shame grew something beautiful and enduring, a love that transcended species and prejudice and past trauma, a love that proved stronger than any darkness that tried to overcome it. And in that kitchen, hanging on the high shelf where it had always been, the copper kettle remained, polished and cared for by each new generation, a symbol of the moment that changed everything, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love are also the simplest, reaching for what you need without fear, trusting that the person beside you means you no harm, choosing kindness over cruelty, gentleness over violence, hope over despair. The kettle remains there still, gleaming in the morning light, waiting to be reached for, waiting to tell its story to those who have ears to hear it.